She walked into that auction with $847 in her pocket and walked out with 18 goats that were half dead, mange-covered, and trembling. The whole room laughed. Grown men, ranchers who'd worked this land for 30 years, laughed until their eyes watered. And you know what she did? She loaded every single one of those animals into her grandfather's rusted trailer and drove them up a mountain that nobody wanted, onto land that everybody said was dead. 3 years later, that same mountain saved their lives. This is Lydia Mercer's story. Stay with me until the end. You won't regret it. And before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and become part of this family, because we tell stories that stay with you. Drop a like and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The Mercer homestead sat at the end of a dirt road that most people in Caldwell County had stopped bothering to name. Maps listed it as Route 9C, but locals just called it the Dead End. Not as a joke, but as a simple statement of fact. The road went nowhere useful. It climbed up past the Miller property, past the old burned-out fence line where somebody's cattle operation had failed in the 90s, and then it just kept going, up into the scrub, up into the thorn country, up toward a ridge that hadn't produced anything worth talking about in longer than most people could remember. That was where Lydia Mercer was headed on a Tuesday morning in early October, with a trailer hitched to a truck that was older than she was, and a folder of papers sitting on the passenger seat that she hadn't been able to read without her hands shaking. She was 23 years old. She had $847 in a checking account and a degree in environmental land management that her mother had called the most expensive mistake in the family's history. She had no job lined up, no plan B, and no real understanding of what she'd gotten herself into by agreeing to inherit what her grandfather had left behind. What she had, instead, was a journal. Her grandfather, Walt Mercer, had died in February. Not dramatically, just the way old men sometimes die when their bodies have simply done all they're going to do. He was 81, lived alone on that ridge for the last 11 years of his life, and left the entire property to Lydia because, as the attorney explained with barely concealed awkwardness, he felt the others wouldn't understand what to do with it. The others being her mother, her 2 uncles, and various cousins who hadn't bothered to drive up to the homestead more than twice in the past decade. Lydia had driven up every summer she could manage, not because she loved hard work, she didn't particularly, but because Walt had something that most of the adults in her life lacked entirely. He paid attention. He watched the land the way other people watch television, slow and careful and fully present. And when he talked about what he saw, it didn't sound like farming. It sounded like something older. "This mountain remembers things," he told her once when she was maybe 15 and bored and wishing she'd stayed home. He was crouched at the edge of a dry creek bed, scooping up a handful of dirt and letting it fall through his fingers. "We just stopped listening." She'd rolled her eyes at the time. She was 15. Mystical statements about dirt were not high on her list of priorities, but she'd remembered it, the way you sometimes remember things you don't understand until much later. The probate took 3 months. During that time, Lydia worked a part-time position at an agricultural extension office and lived with a college friend who was generous enough not to charge her rent, and she read the journal her grandfather had left, not once, but 4 times. It wasn't a dramatic document. No secrets, no treasure maps, nothing that would make a good story at a dinner party. Just 60 years of Walt Mercer's observations about the ridge. Rainfall measurements, soil notes, drawings of plants with careful handwritten labels. Records of what had grown where and when and why he thought it had stopped. And in the final 30 pages, something that looked less like a journal and more like a proposal. A plan, half finished and never implemented, for how the mountain could come back. The key, Walt had written in his careful old man print, was goats. Not cattle, not machines. Not the industrial brush-clearing operations that had torn up half the county in the 90s and left the topsoil so compacted nothing grew back for years. Goats. The right kind in the right numbers worked slowly and deliberately across the land, eating the invasive thorn species that had choked out the native grasses over decades of neglect. Lydia had read that section approximately 11 times. She'd also spent 2 weeks cross-referencing his notes with research papers, calling 2 professors she'd had in school, and staring at aerial photographs of the ridge until her eyes ached. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion. Walt Mercer had been right, and nobody had ever given him the chance to prove it. The Caldwell County Livestock Auction was held on the first Saturday of every month in a low-metal building on the south side of town that smelled permanently of sawdust and animal anxiety. Lydia had been to it twice as a child and found it overwhelming both times. She found it overwhelming this time too, but for different reasons. She'd done her research. She wasn't looking for prime stock. She was looking for Spanish goats, a hardy, brush-clearing breed that had been used for land management across the Southwest for generations before the agricultural industry decided they weren't profitable enough to bother with. She needed animals that could survive rough terrain and poor forage, that were tough enough to work land that had been neglected for decades. She found them in the back pens, 18 of them, huddled in a corner looking like a public health warning. 3 had visible mange patches along their haunches. 2 were limping, not dramatically, but enough to notice. All of them were underweight, coats dull, eyes wary in the way animals get when they've learned that human attention usually means something unpleasant is about to happen. The auction house employee who walked her back there was clearly trying to be diplomatic. "These came in from a property over in Tanner Valley," he said. "Owner passed away. Nobody wanted to deal with them. They've had a rough go." "What's the estimate on them?" He named a figure that was barely more than scrap value, the kind of price you'd pay for animals you expected to sell for parts, not for animals you intended to keep alive. Lydia looked at them for a long time. They looked back at her with that particular goat expression that conveys absolutely nothing and somehow still manages to seem judgmental. "I'll take all 18, she said. The auction floor was a different atmosphere entirely. It was a Saturday morning and the place was full. Ranchers in worn jackets, a few younger men who ran some of the larger operations in the county, a couple of buyers from out of town. The kind of crowd that had opinions and wasn't shy about sharing them. When lot number 47 came up, 8-10-18, Spanish goats, mixed condition, sold as is, there was a murmur through the crowd that wasn't really about the animals. It was about the young woman who'd put in the bid. Lydia knew she was being looked at. She'd known the moment she walked through the door, because she was 23 and female, and clearly not from around here anymore. And all 3 of those things made her conspicuous in this particular room. She kept her eyes on the auctioneer and her hands flat on the railing. The bidding opened. Nobody else moved. There was a pause, the kind that stretches just long enough to become uncomfortable. And then somebody in the back said something she couldn't quite hear, and the row of men nearest him laughed. She didn't look back. She heard the gavel come down. She exhaled slowly through her nose. A man named Dale Houghton, who ran the largest cattle operation in the valley and had the kind of physical presence that suggested he'd never been unsure of himself in his life, fell into step beside her as she moved toward the registration table. "Mercer's granddaughter," he said. It wasn't a question. "That's right." Walt was a good man. He said it the way people say things they mean but have decided don't require elaboration. "Sorry for your loss." "Thank you." He glanced back toward the pens where her 18 goats were being separated from the rest of the lot. "Those animals are in rough shape." "I know." "Rough land up on that ridge." "I know that too." He was quiet for a moment, and she thought maybe that was the end of it. Then he said, "You know what everybody around here thinks about that property?" She looked at him directly. "That it's worthless." He nodded, once like she'd passed a test he hadn't intended to give. "Your grandfather thought different." "My grandfather was right." Something shifted in Dale Houghton's expression. Not disagreement, exactly. More like the look of a man who has decided to reserve judgment but hasn't fully committed to being open-minded about it. "We'll see," he said, and walked away. The drive up to the homestead took 40 minutes on a good day. It took an hour and 15 that afternoon because she stopped twice to check on the animals in the trailer, cracking the back gate and peering in at them with a flashlight while they regarded her with deep suspicion. "I know," she told them the second time. "I know you don't know me. I know this is terrible and you're stressed and everything hurts. But I'm going to need you to trust me for a while." One of the goats, a large female with a torn ear, and a scar across her nose that suggested a history Lydia didn't want to think too hard about, stared at her with flat, rectangular pupils that expressed absolutely nothing. "Okay," Lydia said. "We'll work on the trust thing." She closed the gate and got back in the truck. The homestead itself was smaller than she remembered, or maybe she was bigger. The house was a two-room structure her great-grandfather had built sometime in the 1940s, added onto twice since then in ways that didn't quite match up architecturally. There was a barn that listed slightly to the east, a water catchment system Walt had built himself that still functioned, and roughly 400 acres of land spreading up the ridge in every direction that hadn't been properly managed since sometime in the Carter administration. She stood in the doorway of the house for a long time, looking at the ridge. The thorn scrub ran thick and dark up the slope, Osage orange, eastern red cedar, invasive brush species that had been moving in since the native grasses were overgrazed out of existence decades ago. The kind of landscape that looked, to most eyes, like a lost cause. Walt had seen something different, something worth saving. She pulled his journal from her bag and opened it to the last page, where he'd drawn a rough map of the ridge. She compared it to what she was looking at. Then she opened the trailer and let the goats out. They spilled into the evening light in a rush of nervous energy, spreading across the yard in the disorganized way of animals that have been confined too long. The big female with the torn ear moved to the edge of the yard, looked up the ridge, and then looked back at Lydia with what seemed, possibly, like a question. "Yeah," Lydia said. "That's what we're here for." The first 3 weeks were not good. 2 of the goats were sicker than she'd realized. She spent $400 she didn't have on a veterinarian who drove up from town and gave her a long look that suggested she should probably know what she was doing before she attempted something like this. She slept badly. She ate whatever required the least effort to prepare. She called her mother twice and hung up before the call connected. She woke up on the morning of day 19 with the particular kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from not sleeping enough, but from not being sure if what you're doing makes any sense. She made coffee, stood on the porch, and watched the goats working the lower edge of the ridge. They were moving through the scrub with the focused determination of animals who have found something they understand how to do. The big female, Lydia had started calling her Margaret without particularly deciding to, was working at the base of a cedar cluster, stripping the lower branches with methodical efficiency. Behind the cluster, where the animals had been working for several days, a thin strip of soil was visible that looked different from everything around it. Looser, darker. Lydia walked over and crouched down. She pushed her fingers into the dirt. It was different. Not dramatically, not in any way she could have written up in a paper yet, but different. There was moisture in it that the surrounding soil didn't have, a structure that suggested the root systems underneath hadn't completely died. She sat back on her heels. "Okay, Walt," she said quietly, to nobody, to everything. "Let's see where this goes." The gossip started before the first month was out. Lydia hadn't expected silence. She wasn't naive enough for that, but she had hoped for something closer to indifference. What she got instead was the specific, low-grade social friction of a small community that had decided someone was doing something wrong and felt entitled to say so. It came in the form of comments at the feed store, of trucks slowing down on Route 9C when they passed the lower fence line, of a woman at the post office who looked at her with the particular expression of someone who has already composed the story they're going to tell later. The feed store was where she heard most of it. She went twice a week, and twice a week she stood in the supplement aisle or at the register and absorbed whatever was moving through the community like weather. "Heard she's got goats up there. Spanish goats, 18 of them, paid almost nothing. Because they're worth almost nothing. Walt's granddaughter, right? The one with the college degree?" That last part was always delivered with a particular inflection. Not quite contempt, but something adjacent to it. The implication that education was a kind of distance from reality, and that reality was what these people had, and Lydia lacked. She bought her supplements and her mineral blocks and drove back up the mountain and didn't say anything, because there was nothing useful to say. Not yet. What she did instead was work. The routine she'd fallen into by week 4 was brutal, in the way that only self-imposed schedules can be, because there's nobody to blame for them but yourself. She was up before light, checking water lines that ran from Walt's catchment system down to the troughs she'd positioned along the lower ridge. She moved the portable fencing panels every 3 days, a rotation system she'd designed based on Walt's journal and her own observations of where the goats were being most effective. And she kept notes on everything. Soil condition, which plant species the animals targeted first, where regrowth appeared and how fast, the temperature on the south-facing slopes versus the north, rainfall or the absence of it. The journal was filling up. She'd started a second one by November. Margaret, the big female with the torn ear who had somehow become the unofficial leader of the herd, a position she'd established in the first week through a combination of physical presence and pure stubbornness, had begun to look different. They all had. The mange was clearing on the 3 worst cases. The 2 that had been limping were moving without hesitation across terrain that would challenge a mountain goat half their age. They were filling out, not dramatically, but enough that a person paying attention could see it. Lydia was paying attention to everything. She was also, and this was the part she hadn't expected, beginning to see what Walt had seen. It wasn't a dramatic transformation. It was quiet and slow, and required the kind of attention most people don't have the patience for. But 6 weeks in, the lower section of the ridge, maybe 40 acres where the goats had been working most consistently, looked different from the rest. The thorn scrub was thinner. The cedar clusters that had been closing in for decades were stripped back to their cores, and in the gaps they left, something was happening to the soil that she had to get down on her knees to fully appreciate. Native grass. Not a lawn, not a field. Just thin tentative shoots pushing up through the loosened dirt in places where the goats had worked hardest, looking pale and fragile and absolutely real. She photographed them. She measured them. She wrote everything down. And then she moved the fence panels another 3 acres up the ridge. Dale Houghton showed up on a Wednesday afternoon in late November without calling first, which Lydia suspected was deliberate, the kind of casual drop-by that was actually a test. She was fixing a broken panel on the east fence line when she heard his truck on the road, and she didn't stop what she was doing. She finished crimping the wire, stood up, and turned around. He was leaning against the hood of his truck with his arms crossed, looking out at the section of ridge where the goats were currently working. His expression was unreadable in the way of men who have spent decades negotiating and have learned that showing your reaction first puts you at a disadvantage. "Dale?" she said. "Lydia." He nodded at the ridge. "They're moving faster than I expected. They work hard when they're healthy." He was quiet for a moment, then, "That's the Hanson section up there, east of your property line." "I know, I'm not on it." "Wasn't saying you were." He shifted his weight, recrossed his arms. "Hanson's been trying to clear that brush for 3 years. Machines can't get up that slope. Chemicals run off into the creek." She waited. She'd learned in the months since she'd been back that Dale Houghton didn't make his point until he was ready, and pushing him only made him slower. "How many acres you figure you can get through by spring?" he asked. "On my property, maybe another 60 if the winter isn't too hard on them. And if you had more animals?" She looked at him steadily. "What are you asking me, Dale?" He unfolded his arms, put his hands in his jacket pockets. It was the first time she'd seen him look slightly uncomfortable, and it looked wrong on him, like a big piece of furniture that had been moved an inch out of place. "I got a section on the north face I can't do anything with," he said. "Thorn country, same as yours, worse maybe. I've been thinking about grazing, but cattle can't handle that terrain, and I don't know enough about goats to know if it's stupid. It's not stupid. I know it's not stupid, Lydia. That's why I'm here." His jaw tightened slightly. "Don't make me ask twice." She almost smiled. She didn't. "I'd need to see the land first," she said. "And you'd need to understand this isn't fast. What you're seeing down there happened over 2 months of daily work. It'll take 18 months minimum before you see real grass on a slope that's been neglected as long as yours has. I've been running cattle for 30 years. I understand slow." "Good." She pulled off her work glove and offered her hand. "I'll come look at your north face on Friday." He shook it, once, firmly. Then he got back in his truck without saying anything else and drove down the mountain. She stood there for a moment, looking after him. It wasn't a victory shot. She didn't let herself think of it that way. It was one man with one piece of land, asking a question, That was all. But it was something. December came in cold and dry, which was bad news for the region generally and uncertain news for the ridge specifically. Lydia watched the weather with the particular anxiety of someone whose entire plan depends on moisture, and when the first frost settled across the land in early December, she spent 20 minutes in the barn with a flashlight, checking each animal for signs of distress, running her hands along their sides and checking their legs, and talking to them in the low, even tone she'd developed. Not because she believed they understood her, but because the sound of her own voice, calm and steady, helped her think. "You're all fine," she told them, moving down the row. "You've had worse than this." Margaret watched her from the far corner with the flat patience of an animal that has decided she is tolerable. "Thank you for that endorsement," Lydia said. The cold slowed the grazing operation but didn't stop it. She adjusted the rotation schedule, gave the animals more time on the south-facing slopes where the winter sun was strongest, and spent the shorter days doing things she'd been putting off, repairing the barn roof, cleaning out the water lines, going through the rest of Walt's papers in the house. That last task was the one she'd been avoiding. Walt had been a keeper of things, not a hoarder. The house was spare and organized in the way of people who live alone and have made deliberate peace with their own company, but a preserver. There were boxes of documents going back to the 1950s, when Walt's father had first broken ground on the ridge. Land surveys, old correspondence, receipts for equipment bought and sold. A whole box of photographs, unlabeled, that Lydia went through carefully and could only partially identify. And then, at the bottom of a cardboard box that had been sitting against the back wall of the spare room, something she hadn't expected. A folder labeled, in Walt's handwriting, Highland Prairie Restoration Project, Correspondence. She sat down on the floor with it. Inside were letters, 20, maybe 25 of them, spanning from 1987 to 2003. Some were from university extension programs. Some were from land management researchers. Some were from other ranchers in other states who had apparently been in contact with Walt about what he was doing, or trying to do, or planning to do. They painted a picture she hadn't fully understood before. Walt had tried. He had spent years trying to get someone. A university program, a county agricultural extension, a conservation organization, to take his ridge project seriously. He had written letters and made phone calls and submitted a formal proposal to the State Land Management Office in 1994 that had been returned with a polite rejection citing insufficient evidence of viability. He had tried, and he had been told no, and he had kept trying for another decade before stopping. Not giving up, she thought, just stopping. There was a difference, even if only Walt had understood what it was. She sat on that floor for a long time. When she got up, she put the folder in her bag, made a cup of coffee she didn't really want, and stood at the kitchen window looking at the dark ridge and the thin scattering of stars above it. The cold had sharpened the air. She could see further than usual. She thought about what it must have cost him. All those years of watching something he understood completely, that he knew was right, while everyone around him looked at the same ridge and saw only nothing. She thought about the 18 goats she'd loaded into a trailer while a room full of men laughed. "Okay," she said to the window. "Okay." I'm not sure what. January brought a land surveyor named Pete Okafor, who drove up the mountain on a morning when the temperature was barely above freezing and spent 2 hours walking the lower section of the ridge with Lydia, taking measurements and samples and pausing periodically to write things in a notebook. He'd been recommended by one of the professors she'd contacted during her research phase, a land restoration specialist at the State Agricultural University who had looked at the data she'd been sending him and expressed enough interest to suggest an informal site visit. Okafor was his graduate student. He was 26, meticulous, and extremely quiet, which Lydia found she appreciated more than she'd expected. They walked the 40-acre section she'd completed first. The native grass was sparser than she would have liked. Winter had slowed the regrowth, but it was there, unmistakably, in patches that spread across the slope like something learning to breathe again. Okafor crouched at the edge of one of the larger patches and pressed 2 fingers into the soil. He held them there for a moment. "Water retention's better than the surrounding area," he said. "You can feel it even now." "The root systems of the native species go deeper than the invasives," Lydia said. They're rebuilding the soil structure from underneath. Your grandfather documented this? Theoretically, he didn't get far enough to document the results. Okafor stood up and looked at the ridge. How long until you have comparable data on the upper sections? Depends on the spring. If we get reasonable rainfall, I'd say another full season. He wrote something in his notebook. Dr. Fenwick is going to want to see this. I know. I want him to see it. Okafor looked at her sideways. He had a measured way of looking at things, like he was estimating weight. You know what he's going to say? He's going to say it's promising but preliminary, and he can't put his name on anything yet. Yeah, that's fine, she said. I'm not asking for his name. I'm asking for his eyes. Okafor almost smiled. He'll come in March, he said, if the data holds. She ran out of money in February. Not catastrophically. She hadn't been unaware it was coming. She'd known since November that the math was going to tighten, and she'd been cutting expenses down to the bone for 2 months. But the vet bills had been higher than projected. 2 of the fence panels had failed in a windstorm and needed replacing. And the truck's transmission had started making a sound that she knew, with the resigned certainty of someone who grew up in a family where cars were held together by hope and stubbornness, was going to become an expensive problem. She sat at the kitchen table one night with her laptop and a pad of paper and ran the numbers 3 times, hoping the 3rd time would produce a different result. It didn't. She needed about $4,000 to get through until spring without compromising the operation. She had approximately $600. She thought about her mother. She thought about it for a long time, sitting there in the cold kitchen with the numbers on the page in front of her, and then she closed the laptop and went to bed. The next morning, she called her Uncle Ray instead. Ray Mercer was her father's younger brother, the one member of the family she'd maintained a functional relationship with after her father left. And he had the particular quality of people who have made bad decisions themselves, and therefore don't judge other people's decisions too harshly. He was also, currently, working a decent job in construction and had no dependents. How much? He said, when she'd explained. $4,000. I can pay you back by summer if the spring season goes the way I think it will. There was a pause. She could hear him breathing, which meant he was thinking, which was a good sign. Ray's instant answers were usually no. What does the way you think it will mean exactly? He asked. It means I have 40 acres of recovering native grassland, 18 goats that are healthy and working, a graduate student from the state university who came out last month and said, the soil data is stronger than expected, and a neighbor with 200 acres who's asked me to help with his north face in the spring. Another pause. Dale Houghton asked you for help? Yeah. Dale Houghton, who told your grandfather for 20 years that he was wasting his time. The same, Ray laughed, a short, sharp sound. I'll send it Monday, he said. Don't make me regret it. I'm going to try not to, she said, which was the most honest answer she could give him. Spring came slowly that year, the way it sometimes does in the hill country, teasing for weeks with warm afternoons and then pulling back into cold nights, the land hesitating at the edge of something it wasn't sure about. Lydia watched it with the proprietary anxiety of someone who needed it to commit. By March, the lower 40 acres had changed enough that she could see it from the road. That was what people started noticing, not because Lydia told them to look. She hadn't said anything to anyone about the regrowth beyond what she'd shared with Okafor. But because the visual difference between the restored section and the surrounding scrub had become impossible to miss. The native grass was coming back in earnest now, thin but continuous, a color that was different from the yellowed, dry country grass on the surrounding hillsides. Greener, livelier, like the difference between a plant that's being watered and one that's surviving on what it can find. Trucks started slowing down on Route 9C more often. She saw them from the ridge sometimes, a vehicle pulling over, someone getting out to look, and then getting back in and driving away without stopping. The feed store conversations changed. Not into admiration. She wasn't interested in admiration and wouldn't have trusted it anyway. But the tone shifted. The confident dismissal she'd heard in October had gone quieter, replaced by something more uncertain. She heard it in the way people stopped finishing their sentences around her, in the questions that started to replace the statements. How many acres you covering now? What's your plan for the upper ridge? You treating the soil or just using the goats? She answered what she felt like answering and let the rest go. She was not in the business of convincing anyone of anything. The land was doing that on its own. Significantly larger operation than she'd started with. Dale Houghton's North Face project had officially begun in February. She'd spent a week walking his land with him, mapping the worst of the invasive brush, designing a rotation schedule adapted to the steeper terrain. He'd sourced 10 additional Spanish goats from a contact in the next county, healthier animals than her original 18, which she'd taken as a small, silent acknowledgement that he was paying attention to what she was doing. And he ran the day-to-day operation himself while she consulted twice a week. Dale was a difficult student, not because he wasn't intelligent, he was sharper than he let on, but because he'd been doing things his own way for 30 years, and his instincts kept pulling at him. He wanted to move faster than the method allowed. He wanted results he could see by next month, not next season. "You moved the panels too soon," she told him, on a Tuesday morning in March, standing at the edge of his north face section. "These animals need at least 5 days on this section before you rotate them. You gave them 2. The brush on the east end looked picked over. The root systems aren't done yet. The point isn't to strip the surface, Dale. The point is to break up the root mass so the soil can breathe." He was quiet for a moment. She could see him working through it, the part of him that wanted to argue competing with the part that had seen her lower ridge and knew she was right. 5 days minimum, he said finally. 5 days minimum. He turned and looked out at his land. It was rough country, rockier than her ridge, with a steeper pitch on the north face that made the footing treacherous in wet weather. But the bones were there, the soil, under the scrub, had potential he hadn't been able to access. "My father ran cattle on this face," he said. It came out quieter than his usual register. "Before the brush took over." "When did it change?" "70s? Maybe early 80s? He overgrazed it, and the grass couldn't come back, and the brush moved in." He paused. He knew he'd messed it up, never talked about it, but he knew. Lydia didn't say anything. She had learned in the months since she'd been back that there are things people tell you that don't need a response. They just need to be received. Dale cleared his throat. 5 days, he said again, and walked back toward his truck. By April, she had Margaret's original herd working the upper ridge, the steep, rocky section that Walt had marked in his journal as the hardest and the most important. The thorn scrub up here was older and denser than what she'd started with, and the animals were working harder, moving slower, needing more rest between rotations. She watched them in the evenings from the porch, small shapes moving through the failing light up the slope, and the thing she felt was harder to name than satisfaction. It was closer to recognition, like watching something that had been waiting a long time finally get started. She'd talked to Dr. Fenwick twice by video call since Okafor's visit. He was a careful man, precise in the way academics learn to be when they've been wrong in print before. But the data she'd been sending him had started to move him from careful to interested, and interested to something that, in their last call, had edged toward excited. "The rate of native grass return in your lower section is faster than most restoration models would predict," he said. "That's not a small thing." "Walt predicted it," she said. "It's in the journal." "I know. I've read the pages you sent." He paused. He would have had something remarkable if he'd been given the resources. "He had the resources," she said. "He just didn't have the support." Fenwick went quiet on the other end of the line, then, "No, you're right. That's a different thing." She appreciated that he didn't apologize for it, didn't take on some vague institutional guilt that wasn't his to carry. He just acknowledged the fact and let it be what it was. "I'd like to bring 2 graduate students in May," he said. "Full site assessment. Can you accommodate that? As long as they're okay with a 2-room house and a barn. List to the east." "They're graduate students," he said. "They'll survive." After she hung up, she sat on the porch for a while in the dark. The spring night was cool, but not cold, and the air smelled like the dirt she'd been working in all day and the faint green smell of grass growing somewhere up the ridge. She thought about Walt. She thought about him more in the quiet moments than at any other time. Not with grief exactly, but with the odd intimacy of trying to complete something someone else started, like walking a path in the dark and feeling, occasionally, the impression of boots in the ground ahead of you. He had known this mountain. He had known what it needed and how to give it back. He had been dismissed and worn down and ultimately left to work alone. And he had kept going anyway, kept watching and recording and believing in something nobody else could see. And then he had left it to her. She looked up the ridge, where Margaret's silhouette was just barely visible at the far edge of the pasture, motionless, watching the dark in that patient, uninterpretable way she had. "We're not done," Lydia said quietly. "Not even close." The wind moved through the new grass below the ridge, and for just a moment, before she could talk herself out of noticing it, she could hear how different it sounded from everything that surrounded it. Fuller, less hollow, like land that was learning, slowly, to hold itself together again. She went inside, made a pot of bad coffee, and started writing notes for May. Doctor. Fenwick's graduate students arrived in May as promised. 2 of them, a young man named Corbin, who talked too fast and wrote everything down the moment it was said, and a woman named Dara, who asked questions that came from a different angle than Lydia expected, the kind of questions that made her stop and think before answering instead of just reciting what she already knew. They stayed for 5 days. They slept in the spare room on cots Lydia borrowed from Dale, ate whatever she had in the kitchen without complaint, and spent every daylight hour on the ridge with their equipment and their notebooks. Lydia worked alongside them for the first 2 days, then stepped back and let them do what they'd come to do, watching from a distance in the way you watch something you've built being examined by people who might tell you it isn't as solid as you thought. On the 4th evening, Dara sat down on the porch steps beside her and didn't say anything for a moment. She had the kind of face that gave away what she was thinking slightly before she decided to say it, and what Lydia saw there wasn't disappointment. "The soil carbon data," Dara said. "On the lower section. Can I show you something?" She opened her laptop and turned it so Lydia could see the screen. Numbers, graphs, measurements from the samples they'd taken across the restored 40 acres. Lydia had been keeping her own records, but not at this level of precision. "This column," Dara said, pointing. "Soil organic carbon, pre-restoration estimate based on the surrounding areas. And this one, current readings from your section." The difference was visible even to someone who wasn't looking for it. "Is that normal?" Lydia asked. "For a restoration that's been running 14 months? No." Dara looked at her steadily. "It's not normal, it's fast." Lydia looked at the numbers for a long moment. "Walt documented the original soil composition. He took samples in the 80s. I have the records." "I know. Dr. Fenwick sent them. That's actually why this is—" She stopped, recalibrated. "Your grandfather's data suggests that the native seed bank in this soil has been dormant, not dead. The goats' grazing pattern is activating it. The organic matter from their waste is accelerating the carbon cycle. It's not just clearing brush. It's waking something up." Something tightened in Lydia's chest that she chose not to examine too closely. "Can you put that in writing?" she said. "That's what Corbin's been doing for 4 days," Dara said, and almost smiled. They left on the 5th morning with 2 coolers full of soil samples and a hard drive full of measurements, and Lydia stood in the yard watching their truck disappear down Route 9C, feeling something she couldn't quite locate. Not relief, not confidence, but something that sat in her sternum like a coal that had been lit and was waiting to decide how hot it was going to get. She turned back to the ridge. Margaret was watching her from the fence line with her usual expression of measured tolerance. "Good news," Lydia told her. Margaret turned and walked back into the herd without comment. The summer that followed was the driest in Caldwell County's recorded history. That phrase, recorded history, was used so often on local news and in the county agriculture reports that Lydia began to hear it with a kind of hollow dread, the way you hear a diagnosis repeated until it stops sounding like information and starts sounding like a sentence. The creek at the base of the ridge, which had been running low since April, stopped running entirely in late June. The cattle in the valley needed supplemental feeding by July. The corn across the flat country to the east burned in the fields before it reached knee height. The hill country, which was already marginal land by most definitions, became something worse. The invasive brush that hadn't been cleared dried to the consistency of old newspaper. The cedar clusters on the slopes above Lydia's property, the sections she hadn't reached yet, the upper ridge that was still locked in decades of unmanaged scrub, turned brown and held their dead needles in thick, tinder-dry clusters. The wind came from the southwest in the afternoons, and it was hot, and it smelled like something waiting. Lydia watched the weather with the tight, controlled anxiety of someone who has learned that panic doesn't help and hasn't fully convinced herself of that fact. She checked the catchment system daily. She rationed the water to the troughs, reduced the rotation schedule to keep the goats from overworking the restored sections, and spent evenings on the porch with her phone reading fire weather reports and trying to calculate risks she didn't have enough information to fully calculate. Dale came up in July with his hat in his hands, not literally, but close enough. He stood in the yard and looked at the ridge and then looked at her with the expression of a man who has spent a career not asking for reassurance and has just decided to ask. "How's your water holding?" he said. "Catchment's down to about 40%. It'll last through August if we're careful." "My north face section," he said. "The grass that's come in, is it going to hold?" She knew what he was really asking. "It's not full coverage yet, but the root systems are deeper than the surface looks. It should retain moisture better than bare scrub." "Should," he said. "Should," she said back, because she wasn't going to lie to him. He nodded once and looked back at the valley below. From up here you could see how brown everything was. Even the sections that were usually green in July had gone the color of old hay. "Fire risk this year," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah." "You thinking about what happens if—" "Every day," she said. He was quiet for a moment, then, "Your grandfather's place burned in '89. You know that?" She hadn't known that. She looked at him. Brush fire came off the upper ridge, took the old barn, part of the fence line. Didn't reach the house. He paused. "Walt was up here fighting it with a garden hose, on his own, by himself." He shook his head slightly, the way you shake your head at something that happened a long time ago that you still haven't fully processed. "We didn't help him the way we should have." Lydia didn't say anything. "I'm not—" Dale stopped, started again. "I'm not saying that to make you feel sorry. I'm saying it because I've been thinking about it since you came back." She looked at him for a moment. This was the most personal thing he'd said to her in the 9 months she'd known him, and she could tell it had cost him something to say it, and she didn't want to either dismiss it or make it into more than it was. "He didn't hold it against you," she said finally. "Walt didn't hold grudges. It wasn't how he was built." Dale looked at the ground. "No," he said, "it wasn't." He left 20 minutes later, and she stood in the yard for a while after he'd gone, and then she walked up the ridge to check the panels and count the herd and do the 40 things that needed doing, because that was how she handled most things that were too large to sit with. She put them in her hands. The fire started on a Thursday in early August. She heard about it before she saw it. A phone alert at 4:47 in the morning, the kind that makes a sound designed to wake you regardless of what you have your phone set to. She was out of bed before she was fully conscious, standing in the kitchen in her socks, reading the screen. Wildfire warning, Caldwell County. Active fire reported near junction of Highway 12 and County Road 7. Wind-driven. Moving northeast. All residents in affected zones advised to prepare for possible evacuation. She stood there for 3 seconds, doing math she didn't want to do. Highway 12 and County Road 7 was 12 miles southwest, on the flat countryside of the hills. Moving northeast meant moving toward the hill country, moving toward the ridge. She put on her boots and went outside. The sky to the southwest was orange, not sunrise orange. It was the wrong direction and the wrong time and the wrong quality of light. This was the color of something burning on a large scale, visible even at 12 miles, even in the dark, even through the particular kind of air that a fire creates around itself that changes the way light moves through it. She stood in the yard and looked at it for exactly as long as she allowed herself, which was about 15 seconds. Then she went to the barn. She moved the goats first. The emergency plan she'd had in the back of her mind for months, the one she'd never written down because writing it down felt like inviting it to happen, was actually fairly simple. The restored lower section, the 40 acres she'd been working the longest, was bordered on the south and west by a dirt access road and on the north by a natural rock formation that broke the slope. It was as close to a defensible position as the ridge offered. If she could consolidate the herd there and hold the access road clear, the restored grassland's moisture retention and reduced fuel load might give them a chance. She got the herd moving by 5:30. 18 animals that had come to trust her movements, if not her motives, following her down the slope in the gray pre-dawn with the orange light intensifying to the southwest. Margaret led the way, unhurried and deliberate, which helped because the younger animals took their cues from her. Lydia's phone rang at 5:45. It was Dale. "You seeing this?" he said without preamble. "I'm seeing it. I've got the herd in the lower section. County's calling for voluntary evacuation on your road." "I know." A pause. "Lydia." "I heard you, Dale. The fire's moving fast. Wind shifted around 2 in the morning. This isn't a maybe situation. This is, I know what it is." She stopped walking, stood still in the middle of the field. Around her, the goats spread out across the restored grass, already lowering their heads to graze despite everything, because animals live more completely in the present than humans manage to. "I'm not leaving the herd." The silence on the other end of the line had a specific texture, the silence of a man weighing an argument he knows he's going to lose against the instinct to make it anyway. "I'll be up there in an hour," he said. "Dale, you don't have to us." "I'll be up there in an hour," he said again, and hung up. She stood there for a moment with the phone in her hand. Then she put it in her pocket and went to fill the water troughs. By 8 in the morning, the smoke was visible from the ridge without looking toward the source. It had developed the kind of column that fire creates when it finds real fuel, a dark, churning mass that rose in the southwest and flattened against the upper atmosphere and spread. The smell reached the ridge by 9. Not the clean smell of a campfire, but the complicated smell of a landscape burning, dry grass and cedar and old wood and something underneath all of it that registered as wrong in some animal part of the brain. Dale arrived at 8:40 with his 2 ranch hands, brothers named Cody and Marcus, who were young and competent and had the particular quality of people who stay calm because they haven't yet had enough time to fully understand what they're looking at. They came with shovels, a water tank in the back of Dale's truck, and a chainsaw Lydia hadn't asked for but was immediately glad to see. "Where do you want us?" Dale said. She had the access road mapped in her head, had been mapping it since 5:30. "The south end of the road needs clearing," she said. "There's dead scrub overhanging it in 2 places that'll carry fire across if we don't cut it back. After that, I want a brake line along the west fence, 4 feet wide, everything gone down to dirt." Cody and Marcus looked at Dale. Dale looked at Lydia. "You've been planning this," he said. "In my head. For a while." He nodded. The way he nodded when something confirmed a suspicion he'd been carrying. "Cody, Marcus, you heard her?" They moved. Lydia moved with them, and for the next 3 hours they worked in the thickening smoke with the particular focus of people who have converted fear into physical labor, which is one of the more useful things fear can be converted into. The fire updates came through on her phone in fragments, unreliable and alarming. By 10 in the morning, the fire had crossed the flat country and was moving into the base of the hills. 2 ranches on the southwest approach had burned. Families were evacuating on the county road. The volunteer fire department was fighting to hold the main highway, but the wind was still coming from the southwest, and it wasn't letting up. At 11:15, Pete Okafor called her. She almost didn't answer. Her hands were in the dirt and her eyes were burning from the smoke. But she saw his name and picked up. "I've been watching the fire maps," he said. She could hear something in his voice she hadn't heard before. "Lydia, the fire is going to hit your ridge." "I know." "The fuel load on the upper sections, the uncleared scrub, it's significant. The models are showing—" "Pete." She wiped her face with her forearm. "I know. I've been looking at the same maps. Talk to me about the lower section. Talk to me about what the restoration does to fire behavior." A pause. She could hear him pulling something up, clicking through something. "Fuel moisture in restored native grass versus dry, invasive brush," he said, thinking out loud as much as talking to her. "The native root systems hold moisture even in drought conditions better than—" He stopped. "The reduced fuel load alone changes the fire's behavior. If your moisture retention data holds even 50% in these conditions. Just tell me what you think." Another pause. "I think if the fire reaches your lower section, it loses fuel. I think it slows." He sounded like he was choosing each word very carefully. "I can't promise you anything, but the science says it should behave differently than the unmanaged scrub." "That's all I needed," she said, and hung up. Dale was standing 6 feet away. He'd heard enough. Should, he said, shovel, and went back to work. Bocat. The fire reached the base of the hill country at 1:30 in the afternoon. By then the smoke had reduced visibility on the ridge to less than a quarter mile, and the orange light had taken on the flat, colorless quality that happens when the sun is fully filtered through a smoke column. Lydia's throat hurt. Her eyes were watering constantly, and she'd stopped trying to do anything about it. She'd sent Dale's hands down to the road twice to update the county fire radio on conditions, and come back with reports she was piecing together into a picture she didn't entirely like. The fire had jumped the fire break on the Pemberton property, a ranch 2 miles to the southwest whose owner had already evacuated. It had burned through 300 acres of unmanaged cedar scrub in under 4 hours, which was the kind of number that made the stomach do something unpleasant. At 2:10, she could see the flame front, not directly, through the smoke, in the way you see headlights through heavy rain, as brightness that defines itself by its movement rather than its shape. It was working up the base of the hills in the unmanaged scrub, and it was moving with the kind of energy that comes from fuel that has been building for decades and has finally found its ignition. Dale stood beside her at the west fence line, both of them watching. "It's going to hit the upper section," he said. "Yes." "The uncleared section?" "Yes." "And then it's going to come down?" "Yes," she said. "And then it's going to hit what we've done." He was quiet for a moment. "You really believe it'll hold?" It wasn't a question exactly. It was something between a question and a request. The thing you say to someone when you need them to be certain because you can't quite manage certainty yourself. She looked at the fire moving through the scrub on the upper slope. She thought about 40 acres of soil that had been holding moisture through the driest summer in recorded history. She thought about native root systems that went 18 inches into the ground, about organic matter that held water in ways the surrounding landscape didn't, about 14 months of data that Dara had looked at and said was not normal. She thought about Walt crouching at the edge of a dry creek bed, letting dirt fall through his fingers. This mountain remembers things. "Yes," she said, "I believe it'll hold." He nodded once. He didn't say anything else. He stayed. The fire hit the uncleared upper section of the ridge at 3:20 and moved through it like the thing it was, a force consuming everything that had accumulated over 30 years of neglect, the dead cedar and the dry invasive brush and the old fence posts and the landscape's worth of unprocessed fuel. From the west fence line, Lydia watched it burn and made herself stand still and breathe through her mouth and wait. It took 40 minutes to come down the slope. She tracked it by the sound as much as the sight, the deep variable roar that fire makes when it's moving through heavy fuel, punctuated by sharp reports when individual trees went. The smoke thickened to the point where she could only see the glow, and then she could see the shape of the flame front through it, dropping down the slope toward the boundary between the unmanaged upper section and the beginning of the restored lower 40. Cody and Marcus were at the access road. Dale was at her left shoulder. She could hear him breathing. The flame front reached the boundary. It happened gradually, not dramatically, not the way things happen in movies, with a clean line and an obvious moment. It was more like watching something that's been running hard suddenly encounter terrain that doesn't cooperate. The fire crossed into the restored section, and the character of it changed. The fuel was different, lower, greener at the root level, even through the surface dryness, less accumulated dead matter, the spaces between plants cleared by a 1.5 years of systematic grazing. The flame height dropped. The sound changed, less of the deep roar and more of a surface burning, lower and less confident. It moved into the section. It burned some of it. She wasn't going to pretend it didn't. The surface grass caught and burned in patches. And there were 2 minutes where she thought she had miscalculated everything, and the fear of that was a specific physical sensation behind her sternum that she would not describe to anyone later. But the fire didn't run. It moved slowly, burning what was available and finding less available than it expected. And then it reached the natural rock formation on the north boundary of the lower section, and it found nothing to carry it further, and it stopped having somewhere to go, and it began, slowly, the way large things slow, in stages, not all at once, to lose its momentum. At 4:15, the flame front was not advancing. At 4:30, It was pulling back. By 5 o'clock, what had been an advancing fire was a contained burn area, still smoking heavily but no longer moving. The restored section had burned on the surface in patches. The rock formation had held. The access road brake line they'd cleared that morning had held. And to the east and north, where other properties began, the landscape stood intact. Dale sat down on the ground. He did it the way people sit down when their legs decide before they do, just folding without announcement. And he sat there in the smoke and the terrible orange light, with his arms on his knees and his head down. Lydia stood. She couldn't sit yet. She was still running on whatever chemical the body produces when it has been afraid for 12 hours, and the thing it was afraid of has just, improbably, not happened. After a while she heard Margaret. The sound a herd makes when it's settled, that low, continuous sound of animals at rest. She walked around the end of the fence line and found them in the cleared section on the east side of the lower pasture, most of them lying down, the smoke moving above them in slow, heavy layers. Margaret was standing at the near edge of the group, watching her approach with those unreadable rectangular eyes. "Yeah," Lydia said. Her voice came out rougher than she expected. "Me too." She sat down in the dirt next to the fence and put her back against the post and looked at the sky, which was the color of a bruise in the late afternoon smoke, and she listened to the herd settle and the distant sound of the fire doing what fires do when they run out of things to consume. Her phone rang. Okafor. Then her Uncle Ray. Then a number she didn't recognize that turned out to be a county fire department coordinator, asking about access to the ridge for their equipment. She handled each call one at a time, in order, and between calls she sat in the dirt and breathed the terrible air and did not think about anything in particular. Dale came around the fence eventually and looked at the herd and then looked at her sitting in the dirt. "You all right?" he said. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "Ask me tomorrow." He stood there for a moment, looking at the smoke rising from the upper section of the ridge against the bruised sky. "It worked," he said. It came out flat and quiet, the way people say things they thought they understood in theory and are only now processing in fact. "Part of it burned," she said. "The surface." But it stopped. It stopped. He looked at her. She looked at him. There wasn't really anything else to say about it. Not yet. Not tonight. Not in the middle of the smoke with the adrenaline still running and the landscape still smoldering above them. He held out his hand. She took it and let him pull her to her feet. "Come on," he said. "Let's go check the access road." She went. There was still work to do, which was the most reliable thing she knew about any given day on this mountain. There was always still work to do. She followed him around the edge of the fence line, and behind her the herd shifted and resettled in the clearing, and the smoke moved overhead in slow, heavy layers, and the ridge stood in the late afternoon light, burned in places, scarred, stripped of the surface it had worn for the last 14 months, but standing, not gone, not gone, still there. The morning after a wildfire has a particular quality that people who've never experienced it don't have a reference for. It's not just the smell, though the smell is everywhere and gets into everything. Clothes, hair, the inside of the house, the water in the pipes somehow. It's the light. The smoke that remains in the atmosphere the day after filters the sun into something flat and directionless, so that shadows don't fall the way they should, and the landscape looks like it's been photographed through a lens that removes depth. Everything appears equally far away. Everything appears equally damaged. Lydia was up before dawn because she hadn't really slept. She'd lain on top of the bed in her clothes and done something that resembled sleep. Eyes closed, breathing slow, mind running at about 40% capacity on a loop that covered fire behavior, soil moisture, herd health, insurance documentation, and what the upper section of the ridge was going to look like in the morning. Around 4, she gave up on the pretense and went to make coffee. She took it out to the porch and stood there in the gray pre-dawn and looked at what remained. The upper ridge was black. Even in the dark, she could tell. The quality of the darkness up there was different, flatter, the kind of dark that comes from a landscape that has lost its texture. The cedar clusters that had stood for decades were gone, reduced to standing gray skeletons that she'd be able to see more clearly when the light came. The invasive brush that had occupied that section since before she was born was ash and char, and the smell of it moved down the slope in the still morning air with a persistence that she suspected was going to be with her for weeks. Below the burn line, the restored lower section was visible in the early gray light as a different color. Not green exactly. The surface had burned in patches, scattered burning that had consumed the dry surface grass without killing the root systems underneath, but different from the blackness above, more varied, less final. She stood there looking at it and drinking her coffee and not thinking anything in particular, which was itself a kind of rest. At 6:15, a county fire department truck came up Route 9C, then another. By 7 in the morning, there were 3 vehicles parked in her yard and 4 people in yellow fire gear walking the property line with clipboards and a GPS unit, and she was answering questions she'd already answered twice on the phone the night before about access routes and water sources and the location of the burn perimeter. The fire incident commander was a woman named Shelley Briggs, who had been fighting wildfires for 19 years and had the unornamented directness of someone who has spent 2 decades in situations where clarity is more useful than politeness. She was short, broad-shouldered, and had ash in her hair that she either hadn't noticed or had decided wasn't worth addressing. She stood at the boundary between the burn area and the restored section and looked at it for a long time without saying anything. "This is where it stopped," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." Briggs crouched down the way Okafor had crouched on his first visit, pressing fingers into the soil. She held them there. Then she stood up and looked at the section above, the black upper ridge, and then at the section below, and Lydia could see her doing the calculation in her head. "Your fence line runs east-west here," Briggs said. "Yes. The restored section starts at that line. And above the line, that's where the burn went." "Yes." Briggs looked at her. "How far does your restored section extend to the east?" "About a quarter mile before it hits the Hansen property line." Hansen burned. Lydia had heard this. The Hansen property to the east, the scrubland that Dale had mentioned on that first visit, where the owner had been trying unsuccessfully to clear brush for years, had burned through the night. 600 acres, no structures lost, but the land was gone. "I know," Lydia said. The fire came from the southwest, moved northeast. Briggs was working through it out loud, the way Okafor had worked through the soil carbon numbers that night on the porch. It burned through Hansen, it burned through Pemberton, it burned through the unmanaged sections on your upper ridge. She paused. "And then it hit this section, and it slowed." "Yes." "And then it stopped." "Yes." Briggs turned and looked at her. She had the expression of someone who has spent a career understanding how fire moves and has just encountered something that doesn't fit neatly into that understanding. "What did you do to this land?" she said. Lydia looked at the section, at the patchy surface burn that hadn't killed what was underneath, at the soil that had held its moisture through the driest summer in the county's memory, at 40 acres that had been worthless scrub 18 months ago and was now, improbably, the thing that had stopped a fire that had burned thousands of acres to its south and west. "I let some goats eat it," she said. Briggs stared at her for a moment. Then she pulled out her radio and said something into it, and within 20 minutes there were 2 more vehicles on the property and a conversation underway that Lydia had not expected to be having on the morning after the worst night of her life. The next week was the strangest she had experienced since coming back to the ridge, and that was a high bar to clear. The county fire department's incident report, which was filed 4 days after the fire was fully contained, included a section on fire behavior at the Mercer property that cited the restored grassland as a significant factor in limiting the fire's northeastern advance. The report was not dramatic about it. Incident reports rarely are, but the language was clear. The restored section had functioned as a natural fire break. The fire had lost fuel and momentum upon entering it and had not been able to reestablish forward movement. The report was public record. By the end of the week, it had been picked up by the Regional Agricultural News Service, and by the following Monday, a journalist from the state's largest newspaper had called and left a message asking for an interview that Lydia chose not to return for 4 days while she thought about whether she wanted to. She spent those 4 days working. The surface burn on the lower section needed assessment. She walked every acre with a notebook, cataloging damage and looking for signs of root survival, which she found in enough places to conclude that the restoration hadn't been destroyed, only set back. The root systems that Dara had documented, the ones that went 18 inches into the ground and held moisture through a historic drought, had survived the surface burn. In some sections, she could already see the beginning of regrowth where the burn had cleared competing surface material, a cruel irony that was actually not ironic at all, because fire had always been part of how native grasslands renewed themselves, long before people decided the landscape needed to be managed differently. She documented everything. She took photographs. She wrote it all up in the same careful, unglamorous way Walt had written in his journals, because it wasn't glamour that was going to matter in the long run. It was data. On the fourth day, she called the journalist back. His name was Martin Reeves. He was from the state capital, and he had the brisk, professional manner of someone who speaks to a lot of people and has learned to move through the preliminary stages of conversation efficiently. He wanted to know about the fire. He wanted the dramatic version. She could tell that within the first 2 minutes. He wanted the story of the girl who saved the mountain. She gave him something closer to the truth, which was more complicated and less satisfying as a headline, but which she felt he deserved to hear. It wasn't one decision, she told him. It was 18 months of daily decisions. It was a method my grandfather developed and documented over 60 years that nobody took seriously enough to fund. It was a herd of goats that everyone thought were worthless doing work that nobody thought was possible. She paused. The fire stopping is the part that's visible. The part that matters is what came before it. Reeves was quiet for a moment. Can I come up and see the property? You can come up on Saturday, she said. Bring boots. The road's rough. He came on Saturday with a photographer and spent 3 hours on the ridge. The photographer took pictures of the burn line, that clean, visible boundary between the blackened upper section and the restored lower ground, that Lydia knew were going to be striking images. And she had complicated feelings about that because striking images were going to tell a story that was simpler than what had actually happened, and simple stories were both useful and dangerous depending on how they got used. But she let them take their pictures, and she answered Reeves's questions as carefully and completely as she could, and when they left she stood in the yard and looked at the ridge and made a conscious decision to let the story go where it was going to go, because she'd done what she could do with it, and the rest was outside her control. Dr. Fenwick called on the Sunday after the article ran. She'd expected the call. She'd sent him a copy of the article with a brief message, but she hadn't expected his tone, which was different from his usual careful precision. He sounded less like an academic managing his certainty and more like a person who had just had something confirmed that he'd been hoping was true. The fire behavior documentation from the incident report, he said, almost before she'd said hello. Can I get a copy? Already sent it. Check your email. Lydia. A pause. The burn line photographs in the article. I've been looking at them for an hour. And? The differential is more dramatic than I expected. The restoration section shows significantly less severe burn damage than... He stopped. She could hear him recalibrating, trying to return to his professional register and finding it slightly out of reach. I want to write this up, he said. Formally, a full research paper. Your data, Dara and Corbin's site assessment data, the fire behavior documentation, all of it. I know, she said. It's going to take time. It won't be published for at least a year, maybe longer, depending on peer review. I know that too. But it's... He stopped again. Your grandfather's original proposal, the one that was rejected in 1994. I read it again last week. He was describing exactly what happened here. Exactly. She was quiet for a moment. There was something about hearing someone else say that out loud that was harder to absorb than she expected, and she sat with it for a few seconds before she trusted her voice. Yeah, she said. He was. I want to include his documentation in the paper, with appropriate attribution. I think it's important that the record shows where this work came from. He'd have liked that, she said. He spent a long time wanting someone to take it seriously. After she hung up, she sat at the kitchen table with the second journal she'd filled, the one she'd started in November, 6 months into the project, and she turned to the last entry she'd written, which was dated the day before the fire. She'd written it in the evening after checking the panels, noting that the upper section showed severe drought stress and that fire risk would be elevated through August. She found a blank page and wrote the date, the day after the fire. And then she sat for a while thinking about what to put down, because there was too much to put down all at once, and she had learned from Walt and from the work itself that the discipline wasn't in having things to say. It was in choosing which things were worth saying. She wrote, "Lower section held, root systems survived, regrowth already visible in patches. The mountain held what we gave it." Then she closed the journal and went to check on the herd. Chat. The first rancher showed up 9 days after the fire. His name was Gerald Pruitt. He ran a 300-acre operation on the northeast side of the county that had escaped the fire's path but had been watching the smoke for a week with the particular dread of someone who knows the conditions that produced this disaster haven't changed. He was 64 years old, sun-damaged in the way of men who have worked outdoors their entire lives, and he had the careful, evaluating look of someone who has been doing things one way for a long time and is considering, with significant discomfort, the possibility that there might be another way. He stood in the yard and looked at the ridge for a while. She let him look. "I read the article," he said. "Okay." "And the fire report. My son found it online." "Okay." He looked at her. "I got 200 acres on my east face that I can't do anything with. Been trying to clear it for 10 years. Too steep for machines. Too close to the creek for herbicide." She had heard variations of this statement 4 times in the past week. Each time, some part of her wanted to point out that this was the same land those same people had been managing, or not managing, for decades, while Walt Mercer tried to tell them what was possible, and nobody listened. But she didn't say that, because it wasn't useful, and Walt himself hadn't been the kind of person who needed other people to admit they were wrong. He just wanted to do the work. "I can come look at it," she said, "but I want to be straight with you about what this is. It's not fast, it's not cheap to set up, and it's not going to look like anything for at least a year." Pruitt nodded slowly. "The article said your grandfather had the idea." "The article was right. Walt Mercer." He said the name the way people say the names of people they didn't know well enough while those people were alive. "I bought some fence posts from him once, long time ago. Seemed like a man who knew what he was talking about." "He did," she said. "He really did." She scheduled a site visit for the following week. By the end of that same day, she had 2 more calls from ranchers in the county asking the same questions Pruitt had asked. She answered them all, set up site visits where she could, and spent the evening making a list of everything she was going to need if this was actually going to become something larger than 1 ridge and 1 stubborn woman with 18 goats. The list was longer than she was comfortable with. Dale came up on a Wednesday afternoon, which had become something close to a regular thing. Not by agreement, but by accumulation, the way habits form when 2 people find they have more to discuss than either of them initially expected. He walked the burn line with her, the way he'd walked the ridge on his first real visit almost a year earlier, except that this time he was looking at something that had proved itself in a way that neither of them had been fully certain it would, and that changed the quality of his silence. "3 more ranchers have called me," she said, as they stood at the eastern edge of the lower section where the burn had been lightest. Pruitt, Hawkins, and somebody named Delaney from over near the county line. "Terry Delaney," Dale said. "He's got rough country on his south face. Been in the family 3 generations. Can he be worked with?" Dale thought about it. "He's stubborn, but he's not an idiot." "Good enough," she said. "That's most of what I need." Dale picked up a handful of the burn-darkened soil and turned it in his hand. "Your soil still looks different than mine," he said, "even after the fire. The root systems changed the structure. Fire doesn't reach that deep." He let the soil fall. "How many more animals do you need if you're taking on Pruitt and the others?" She'd been doing this math for a week. Minimum 30 additional animals, maybe 40. And I need another person, someone who can run a rotation schedule and knows how to read land. Dale was quiet for a moment. Then, "My son's been interested in what you're doing. Marcus told him about it. He's 22, he's been helping me on the cattle operation, but He paused. "He asks different kinds of questions than I do." She looked at him. This was another thing that cost him something, she could tell. Not because he was reluctant to offer his son, but because admitting his son thought differently than he did was its own kind of acknowledgement. "What kind of questions?" she said. "The kind that start with why instead of how," Dale said. She thought about that. "Send him up," she said. "I'll talk to him." They walked the east boundary in silence for a while. The sky above the burned upper section was clear. The smoke had finally thinned out over the past week, and the standing gray skeletons of the dead cedar showed against it in a way that was almost architectural. Not beautiful exactly, but not without its own honesty. "I've been thinking about what you said," Dale said, "about Walt. I said a lot of things about Walt. That he didn't hold grudges." He paused. "I've been thinking about whether I could say the same about myself." She didn't say anything. This wasn't a conversation that needed her input. "I was hard on him," Dale said. Not cruel, but I was the loudest voice in this county telling people that Ridge was a lost cause, and Walt knew I was saying it." He was quiet for a moment. "He still waved at me every time I passed his gate." "That sounds like him," she said. "Yeah," he exhaled through his nose. "I want to put some money into this. Not a loan, a real investment. Whatever you need to expand. Equipment, animals, whatever." He said it quickly, the way you say something you've been holding on to and need to release before you can think about it too hard. "I know I don't have any right to be part of it. I know I probably don't deserve to be. But I want to do something that's actually useful instead of just telling you I was wrong." She stopped walking. He stopped a step ahead of her and turned around. He had his hat in his hand, actually, this time turning it by the brim in the way of a man who needs something to do with his hands when he said something important. She looked at him. He was 61 years old and had been the loudest, most confident voice of dismissal in a county full of dismissal. And now he was standing in the middle of the land that had proved him wrong with his hat in his hands, asking to be useful. She tried to figure out what she felt about that and found it was more complicated than she'd expected. Not warm and not cold. Just human. Just the particular complexity of people who hurt things without meaning to and then live long enough to understand what they did. "I'm going to need a written agreement," she said. "Whatever you invest, it stays in the operation. You don't get to tell me how to run it. I know that. And I want it documented that the method is my grandfather's, formally, not just in Dr. Fenwick's paper, in the operating structure of whatever this becomes." Dale looked at her. "That's fair," he said. "That's more than fair. And one more thing." "What?" "The next time someone in this county has an idea that doesn't fit the way things have always been done," she said, "I want you to be the first person who tells them to keep going instead of the first person who tells them to quit." He was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved through the burned section above them, carrying the smell of ash and the faint, almost imperceptible underneath smell of something living. The soil, she knew, was already beginning to process the organic matter the fire had left behind. "Yeah," he said. "I can do that." She nodded. "Okay then, put your hat back on. We've still got the east boundary to walk." The conversation she hadn't expected came on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after the fire. She was in the barn checking a fence panel she'd brought in for repair when she heard footsteps in the yard, and when she came out, she found a man she didn't immediately recognize standing by the gate looking at the ridge. He was maybe 70, lean in the way of people who've never stopped moving, with white hair cut short and hands that looked like they'd been doing physical work for more years than they hadn't. He was looking at the lower section of the ridge with an expression she couldn't read. "Can I help you?" she said. He turned. "You're Walt's granddaughter." "I am." He looked at her for a moment. "I'm Frank Collier. I was on the County Agricultural Board in 1994. She went very still. Frank Collier had been the board's chairman when Walt's proposal had been submitted and rejected. His signature was on the rejection letter. She had read that letter enough times to know it by heart. "Okay," she said. Her voice came out flat and carefully neutral. "I read the fire report," he said, "and the article. And I've been thinking about whether to come up here for 2 weeks, and my wife finally told me that thinking about it wasn't doing me or anybody else any good." She didn't say anything. She was waiting to find out what he wanted because she genuinely didn't know, and she'd learned not to fill silence with assumptions. He looked back at the ridge. Walt came to the board meeting himself. Most applicants sent a representative. He came in person, sat in that little chair at the end of the table, and spent 20 minutes explaining what he wanted to do up here. He was quiet for a moment. He brought soil samples in little glass jars. He'd labeled them all. A pause. We asked him 3 questions, and then we moved on to the next item on the agenda. Lydia said nothing. "I've been in land management work for 40 years, Frank said. I've seen a lot of proposals. I've seen a lot of people who thought they had something nobody else had seen." He turned back to her. His eyes were doing something she hadn't expected. Not performing regret, just holding it, the way you hold something heavy when you're not sure you're going to be able to put it down cleanly. Most of them were wrong. Walt Mercer was not wrong, and we sent him home with a form letter. The silence that followed was long enough to have weight. "What are you here for, Mr. Collier?" she said. "I don't know exactly," he said. "I'm not here to ask for anything. I don't think I have that right." He looked at the ridge one more time. "I think I needed to see it, what it would have looked like if we'd listened." She thought about saying something that would make this easier for him. She thought about it and decided that wasn't her job. "It's a good piece of land," she said. "It always was. That's what he kept telling people." Frank Collier nodded. He stood there for another moment, then put his hat back on his head and walked back to his truck without saying anything else. She watched him go. Then she turned and looked at the ridge, at the patchy surface burn that was already beginning to show the first pale suggestions of regrowth through the black, at the rock formation on the north boundary, at the standing gray skeletons of the cedar on the upper section against the clear sky. She thought about Walt sitting in a small chair at the end of a table with his labeled jars of soil, trying to explain something he'd spent 30 years understanding to people who had 20 minutes to decide whether it mattered. She thought about the 18 months that had followed her return, the money she'd run out of and borrowed back. The morning she'd gotten up before light, not knowing if what she was doing made sense. The night of the fire, sitting in the dirt with her back against the fence post, listening to the herd settle. She thought about Margaret, who had been watching her from the pasture this entire time with her standard expression of impartial assessment. "I know," she said, to nobody in particular, to the ridge, to the October air, to whatever remained of Walt in the land he'd spent his life trying to restore. "I know." She went back to work. The Regional Land Management Conference in early October was held at a hotel in the county seat, a beige, functional building that had hosted 40 years of agricultural meetings and smelled faintly of carpet cleaner and old coffee. Lydia had been invited to present a session on the restoration project, which she had agreed to do with the specific understanding, negotiated with the conference organizer over 2 phone calls, that her grandfather's work would be credited clearly, and that the session would not be titled anything with the word revolutionary in it, because she found that word, applied to what she was doing, both inaccurate and slightly offensive. They settled on grassland restoration through targeted grazing, a mountain ridge case study. She presented to a room of about 60 people, ranchers, land managers, a few county officials, 2 representatives from the State Forestry Service who had been in the fire incident reports and wanted to understand what they'd documented. Dr. Fenwick was in the back row. Pete Okafor was beside him. Dara was somewhere in the middle, and Lydia saw her taking notes even though she'd already seen all of this data, which was the kind of person Dara was. Lydia was not a natural public speaker. She didn't perform ease she didn't feel, and she didn't work the room the way people who are good at presentations work it, with movement and eye contact and strategic pauses. She stood at the front and talked about what she'd done and what the data showed and what her grandfather had understood 40 years before any of it. And she let the information carry the weight because the information was, in fact, remarkable enough not to need performance. At the end of the formal presentation, the Forestry Service representatives asked about the fire behavior. She walked them through what had happened and what the incident report documented and what the soil data explained about why it had happened. When she finished, the room was quiet in a way that felt different from the quiet of an audience waiting for the next thing. It felt like the quiet of 60 people doing math. Then someone in the back, a rancher she didn't recognize, older, with the kind of deliberate stillness of someone who doesn't ask many questions but asks the ones that matter. Raised his hand. "The goats," he said. "The original 18. Where'd you get them?" "A livestock auction," she said. "They were in rough shape. Nobody else wanted them." He nodded slowly. "And they're still up there?" "Yes. All 18. He nodded again, turned to the man beside him, and said something quiet. The man beside him nodded too. She didn't know what they were going to do with that. She didn't know what any of the 60 people in that room were going to do with what she'd told them. That wasn't something she could control. What she could control was the work. What she could control was the next rotation, and the data she'd collect from it, and the soil samples she'd send to Okafor, and the conversation she needed to have with Dale's son next week, and the 3 more site visits she had scheduled before November. That was what she could control. She'd do that, and she'd let the rest of it find its own level. She thanked the room, gathered her notes, and walked off the small stage. Dr. Fenwick met her at the edge of the room with a cup of the bad conference coffee, which she accepted because she needed something to do with her hands. "Good," he said simply. "It was fine," she said. "It was good," he said. "Your grandfather would have been—" "Don't," she said quietly, not unkindly, just with the specific tiredness of someone who has heard that sentence started too many times in the past month and doesn't have the energy to absorb it one more time tonight. Fenwick stopped. He looked at her for a moment and then nodded. "Fair enough," he said. She drank the bad coffee. Outside the beige hotel, the October air was cooling fast, and through the glass doors she could see the parking lot and the dark hills beyond it, and somewhere beyond those hills, 40 minutes up a road most people had given up on, a ridge that wasn't finished yet, not even close. Part 5. Louis. Viết 4.500 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện và hối thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới, liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch, sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ, phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ 3, giữ đồ kịch tính không viết lan man, có quan điểm cá nhân, thông điệp, bài học, góc nhìn con người. Nhân vật không hoàn hảo, hội thoại tự nhiên, tránh ngôn ngữ văn chương sáo rơi và cụm từ AI điển hình. Việt như nhà văn chuyên nghiệp, không như AI cố gắng nghe sang. Có yếu tố con người, cầm miêu tả qua mượt mà và hoàn hảo, phần 5 giải quyết hết vấn đề và kết thúc trọn vẹn câu chuyện. Câu chuyện không nhắc đến Chúa. Louis trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document, chỉ dần bắt buộc, không được xuất hiện trong nội dung truyện. Đây là một câu chuyện điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu được tạo ra chỉ nhằm mục đích giải trí. Không đề cập hay ngụ ý rằng nó dựa trên sự kiện có thật, người thật hoặc câu chuyện có thật. Không sử dụng các cụm từ như dựa trên một câu chuyện có thật, theo ghi chép hoặc bất cứ điều gì tương tự. Tất cả các nhân vật, địa điểm, tổ chức và sự kiện phải hoàn toàn hư cấu. Show More Part 5. A Legacy That Changes the Frontier. The first snow of the season came early that year, arriving on a Thursday in late November before anyone had quite finished processing what the summer had been. Lydia woke to 2 inches of it covering the yard and the access road and the ridge above, and she stood on the porch with her coffee and looked at it for a long time. Snow changed the burn line's appearance, softened the distinction between the blackened upper section and the recovered lower ground, laid a uniform quietness across everything. For a few hours each morning, the mountain looked the way it might have looked before any of it happened. Before the drought, before the fire, before 18 months of daily work that had been difficult in ways she hadn't fully anticipated and was not finished being difficult. She finished her coffee and went to check the herd. This was still the first thing. It had been the first thing for 2 years now, and she didn't expect it to change. The routine wasn't a comfort exactly. It was more structural than that, the way a building's frame is structural. You don't notice it when it's working. You notice it when something's wrong. The herd was fine. 36 animals now, the original 18 plus 18 more that Dale had sourced over the spring and summer, distributed across 3 different rotation sections. Margaret was in the east pen, standing in the snow with her characteristic expression of mild contempt for conditions she had not approved. She looked at Lydia the way she always looked at Lydia, which was to say, with the particular flatness of an animal that has decided you are reliable without having any particular feelings about it. "Good morning to you too," Lydia said. She filled the troughs. She checked the fence line. She came back inside and sat at the kitchen table with Walt's original journal open in front of her. Not reading it, just having it there, the way you keep a photograph of someone on a desk. Then she pulled her own notebooks toward her and started writing up the previous week's observations, because that never stopped needing to be done. By the time Dale's son Noah arrived at 8:30, she had filled 4 pages and her second cup of coffee had gone cold. Noah Houghton was 22 years old and looked like his father if his father had been put through a slightly different process. Same broad build, same economy of movement, but with eyes that moved differently. Observant in a way Dale's weren't, or maybe in a way Dale had trained himself out of over decades of having to make fast decisions about things. Noah looked at things the way you look at them when you're still trying to understand them rather than manage them. He'd been coming up to the ridge 3 days a week since September. Lydia had been harder on him than she'd expected to be, not from resentment of his father, but because she'd discovered she had strong opinions about how this work should be learned, and those opinions boiled down to slowly and with full attention, or not at all. He'd handled it without complaint, which was the first sign he was worth the time. The second sign was that he asked the right kinds of questions, the why before how kind, as Dale had said. And when she gave him an incomplete answer because she didn't have the full one, he didn't fill in the gap with assumption. He waited. That morning he came in stamping snow off his boots, and she handed him her notebook and pointed to the east section's rotation data from the previous week. "Tell me what you see," she said. He sat down and read it the way she'd taught him, not skimming, starting from the soil notes and working up to the surface observations. She poured herself a fresh cup of coffee and let him work. After 5 minutes, he said, "Regrowth rate in the post-fire sections is faster than the pre-fire baseline." "Yes." "Because the burn cleared competing surface material." "Partly." He thought about it. "And the ash added organic matter." "Right." He looked at the page again. "So the fire wasn't only damage." She sat down across from him. "Fire has always been part of how this landscape works. Before people started suppressing it, this hill country experienced fire cycles that kept the invasive species from establishing the way they did over the past 40 years. We've been trying to undo a century of fire suppression with 18 months of grazing." She paused. "The fire did in one afternoon what would have taken us another 2 years. Noah was quiet for a moment. "That's a hard thing to say out loud when it burned everybody's land." "Yes," she said. "It is. That's why you say it carefully and only when it's useful." He looked at her. "Is it useful to say it now?" "To you? Yes. To a rancher who just lost 300 acres? Not yet." He nodded slowly. This was the kind of thing she'd been teaching him that wasn't in any journal or research paper. The difference between what's true and what's useful to say, and the rarer skill of knowing when those two things were the same. They spent the next 2 hours on the east section, walking the post-fire recovery area with notebooks, taking measurements, discussing what they were seeing. The snow was light enough not to obscure the ground, and in places where the burn had been surface level only, the new growth showed through it in thin but persistent lines that made her feel something she'd stopped trying to name and had decided to just let be what it was. At one point, Noah crouched at the base of a recovering native grass patch and pressed his fingers into the soil the way Dara had, the way Okafor had, the way Briggs had on the morning after the fire. It seemed to be the instinctive gesture of anyone who paid attention to this land long enough. Eventually, you needed to feel it directly. "Different from my dad's north face," he said. "Your dad's north face has been in restoration for 8 months less," she said. "Come back in June." He stood up and looked at the ridge. "You think this actually scales?" he said. It came out like a statement, but landed like a question. "I think Walt thought it scaled," she said. "That's why he spent 20 years trying to get someone to listen." "What do you think?" She looked at the ridge. The snow had stopped falling, and the air had the particular clearness that comes after, and the recovery section spread up the slope in its uneven, imperfect, genuinely promising way. "I think the land scales," she said. I'm less sure about the people. Noah looked at her. What does that mean? It means the method works anywhere the soil has something to come back to. It means the goats do what they do regardless of whether anybody believes in them. She paused. The hard part isn't the restoration. The hard part is convincing people to give it enough time to work and to keep their hands off it when their instincts are telling them to intervene. Like my dad in the rotation schedule. Like your dad in the rotation schedule, she agreed. He almost smiled. It was a complicated expression, the specific expression of someone who loves a person and also has a clear-eyed view of their limitations, which is one of the more adult things a person can manage. Dr. Fenwick's paper was published in the spring, not a small journal, a major one of the primary peer-reviewed publications in land management and restoration ecology, which meant that people whose opinions shaped policy in 6 states were going to read it. The title was long and academic, and the abstract was dense with terminology, but the core of it was clear. A controlled study of targeted grazing for native grassland restoration in hill country terrain using a methodology developed by Walt Mercer and implemented by his granddaughter over a period of 22 months, demonstrating soil carbon recovery rates that exceeded standard restoration models by a significant margin, and this was the part that everybody quoted when they wrote about it, creating conditions that demonstrably reduced wildfire fuel load in a fire event that was independently documented by county and state fire authorities. Walt Mercer was listed in the acknowledgments section, and in a historical context paragraph that Fenwick had written carefully, which described him as the originating researcher and noted that his proposal had been declined by the County Agricultural Board in 1994, and that the current work represented both the validation and the continuation of what he had begun. Lydia read that paragraph 4 times when the advance copy came through. She was sitting at the kitchen table with Walt's journal open next to her laptop, and at some point during the 4th reading, she had to put the laptop down and look out the window for a while, because there are certain kinds of correctness that arrive too late and feel like both a gift and a wound simultaneously, and she was not going to pretend otherwise just because she was the sort of person who didn't make a show of things. Her Uncle Ray called that evening. I saw the paper, he said. I mean, I didn't understand most of it, but I saw it. Yeah. Walt's name is in there. Yeah, Ray. It is. A pause. You think he'd be surprised? She thought about it genuinely, about Walt crouching at that dry creek bed when she was 15 letting dirt fall through his fingers, about 60 years of journals and labeled soil samples and a proposal that got 3 questions and a form letter rejection, about a man who waved at the neighbor who spent 20 years telling people he was wrong. No, she said. I think he'd be annoyed it took this long. Ray laughed, that same short, sharp sound she'd heard on the phone that February when she'd asked to borrow $4,000. Yeah, he said. That sounds right. The conference call with the State Forestry Department happened on a Tuesday in April, and it lasted 2 hours, which was 45 minutes longer than Lydia had scheduled for it. There were 7 people on the call: fire prevention specialists, land management officers, a policy advisor from the governor's office, who asked careful questions and didn't say much else. They had been circulating Fenwick's paper and the fire incident documentation for 2 months. They had their own data about how the fire had moved across Caldwell County and where it had stopped and why. They wanted to talk about a pilot program. The specifics of the conversation were procedural and sometimes tedious and involved several conversations about funding mechanisms that Lydia found genuinely difficult to follow. But the shape of what they were proposing was clear enough. A 3-year program to implement targeted grazing restoration across identified high-risk fire zones in the state's hill country regions, using the methodology she and Walt had developed, managed by a coordinating organization they were looking to formalize. We'd want you involved in the program structure, the policy advisor said, in a leadership capacity. I'm not a policy person, she said. We're not asking you to be a policy person. We're asking you to be the person who knows what actually works. She sat with that for a moment. Outside the window of the 2-room house, the April Ridge was doing what the April Ridge now reliably did, showing green in the lower sections, the native grass coming back for its second full season stronger than the first, the way things come back when you give them what they need for long enough. I have conditions, she said. We expected you would. The program attribution has to include Walt Mercer's original research. That's not negotiable, and it's not about sentiment. It's about accuracy. Understood. The ranchers participating need proper training, not a handout. This doesn't work if people don't understand why they're doing it. You can't just put goats on land and walk away. Agreed. And the timeline has to be honest. No program benchmarks that require results before the land is ready to produce them. I've seen what happens when people need a win by quarter 3. They start cutting corners, they panic when the first season looks slow, and they undo 12 months of work in a week. There was a brief silence on the other end of the call. That's going to be a harder conversation with the funding structure, the policy advisor said. I know, Lydia said. Have it anyway. Another pause, then, we'll work on it. After the call, she sat at the table for a while, not doing anything in particular. Then she got up, put on her boots, and walked out to the ridge. Noah was up there with the herd, moving the east section panels for the week's rotation. He'd gotten better at reading the land. She could see it in the way he moved through it, which was different from how he'd moved through it in September. Less deliberate. More natural, the way things get natural when you've done them enough times in enough different conditions that your body starts doing them without requiring instruction from your brain. She walked up and helped him with the last panel, and they stood for a minute looking at the section the herd would work this week, a patch of recovering post-fire ground on the upper-lower ridge, the transitional zone between the burned area and the fully restored section, which was the most interesting ground on the property right now, from a data perspective, and also just from the perspective of watching something figure out how to come back. State Forestry called, she said, about the pilot program. You knew about that? He gave her a look that reminded her briefly of Dale. My dad mentioned it. She decided not to examine the information flow in that particular triangle. They want to move forward, 3-year program, multiple sites across the hill country. Noah turned to look at her. You said yes. I said I had conditions. But you're going to do it. She looked at the recovering section. A pair of the younger goats were already working the near edge of it, heads down and focused in the particular way animals are focused when they're doing something they're built for. Yeah, she said, I'm going to do it. He was quiet for a moment. You're going to need more people. I know. People who know what they're doing. That's the hard part, she said. Finding people who'll slow down enough to actually learn it instead of thinking they already know it. He looked back at the herd. I can help with that. She looked at him. He said it the way young people sometimes say serious things, without particular ceremony, just placing the statement on the table and letting it be there. You've been doing this for 7 months, she said. I know. That's not enough to teach someone else. I know that too. He paused. But I know enough to help you figure out who's going to be good at it and who isn't. She considered him for a moment. This 22-year-old with his father's build and his own set of eyes, standing in the snow-remnant mud of an April ridge that had been burned and survived and was in the process of deciding what it was going to be next. How would you do that? She said. Take them out here, he said simply. Give them a notebook and tell them to write down what they see, and then read what they wrote. She thought about that. It was the same test Walt had applied in one form or another his whole life, not asking people what they knew, but watching what they noticed. Whether they could be still enough and patient enough to actually see what was in front of them instead of what they expected to see. Yeah, she said, that would work. Gerald Pruitt's east face had its first full season of restoration that spring, and she visited it in May with Noah and Pete Okafor, who drove up from the university with a soil sample kit and the focused enthusiasm of someone whose paper had just been published, and who was now collecting the follow-up data with the specific pleasure of a person whose work has acquired momentum. The Pruitt land was rougher than the Mercer Ridge, stonier, with a more severe pitch in the lower sections that made the footing unpredictable. But the bones were good. She'd said that on her first visit, and she still believed it, and 8 months of targeted grazing on the worst sections had begun to prove it in the way that only time proves things. Pruitt walked the property with them in the quiet way of a man watching something he'd been skeptical of and is now calibrating against reality. He didn't say much. He looked at the soil. He looked at the thin but genuine return of native species in the areas the goats had worked longest. He looked at his granddaughter, who was 9 years old and had come along because it was a Saturday and she wanted to see the animals, and who was currently following Margaret, who Lydia had brought along because Margaret went everywhere Lydia went now, whether she was invited or not, with the determined focus of a child who has identified a creature she intends to befriend. "She's not friendly," Noah said, coming up beside the girl. "She likes me," the girl said with complete confidence, which was wrong, but not wrong in a way that time wouldn't potentially correct. Pruitt watched his granddaughter following the goat through the recovering brush, and something in his face did what faces sometimes do when they think you're not paying attention. "My dad ran cattle on this land," he said. Not to Lydia specifically, just to the air. "I know," she said. "He would have thought this was crazy. The goats. All of it." "Probably." Pruitt looked at the recovering section set, at the soil that was darker than the surrounding ground, at the native species pushing back through the loosened dirt. But he also would have looked at this and not been able to say it wasn't working. "No," Lydia said. "He wouldn't have been able to say that." Pruitt nodded slowly. "My granddaughter likes it," he said. "She asked me last week if she could have a goat." Lydia looked at the girl, who had gotten close enough to Margaret to touch her flank. Margaret was tolerating this with visible reluctance, and Lydia suspected the tolerance would last approximately another 45 seconds. "Tell her to start with the books first," Lydia said. "Then we'll talk about the goat." The memorial she hadn't planned happened in June, on what would have been Walt's 83rd birthday. She hadn't planned it because she wasn't a planner of ceremonies, and she didn't know how to make one without it feeling false. But Ray came up, and her Uncle Terrence, who she hadn't seen in 2 years and who had the uncomfortable energy of someone who knows he stayed away too long and isn't sure what to do about it. Dale came, which surprised her. Noah came because Noah was there most days anyway. Okafor came because he happened to be in the county for a site visit, and she mentioned it without quite inviting him, and he showed up anyway. They stood on the lower ridge in the June heat, which was warm but nothing like the brutal heat of the previous summer, and they looked at what the land had become. It wasn't a green field. It wasn't a pristine, restored prairie. It was a working piece of hill country that had been burned on its upper section and was recovering in the way recovery actually happens, which is messily and unevenly and with periodic setbacks that require adjustment. The native grass was real and present and spreading, but it wasn't everywhere. The fence panels were visible across the slope in their current rotation positions. 2 of the younger goats had gotten into the wrong section 2 weeks ago and set back a patch of soil preparation that had taken 3 months. The barn still listed to the east. It was not a finished thing. It was a living thing, which meant it was always going to be in some stage of being worked on. Ray stood next to her and was quiet for a while, which was unusual for Ray. "He would have said something specific about this," he said finally. "Something that sounded simple but wasn't." "He would have," she agreed. "What do you think he would have said?" She looked at the ridge. She thought about 60 years of notebooks, about labeled soil samples in glass jars that 3 people on a county board had given 3 questions before moving on to the next agenda item. About the particular stubbornness of a man who kept going, not because he was certain he was right, but because he believed the land was worth what it was going to take. "I think he would have said something about the soil," she said. "He always came back to the soil, how it holds things, how it remembers." "That sounds like him," Ray said. "The mountain remembers things," she said, and she wasn't quoting him exactly, but she was close enough. "We just stopped listening." The wind came up the ridge the way it usually did in the early afternoon, moving through the native grass in the lower section with that particular sound that was different from the sound of dry scrub, fuller, less hollow, the sound of something that has enough structure to catch the air and hold it for a moment before letting it go. Nobody said anything for a while. That was fine. There are certain kinds of moments where saying things is the thing that would ruin them. The state pilot program began in the fall. 3 sites, 60 goats sourced from across the region, 4 people trained by Lydia and Noah over a 6-week period that was more intensive than Lydia had designed it to be and less intensive than she felt it should have been, which she decided to accept as the reality of working within a structure that had timelines she didn't entirely control. She made her peace with imperfect things. It was an ongoing negotiation. The research paper generated 2 follow-up inquiries from land management programs in neighboring states. Okafor was leading his own site study now, with Dara as his co-investigator, at a fire-affected region 2 counties north. Fenwick was advising 3 separate restoration projects that had cited his paper in their proposals. The work had acquired the specific momentum that happens when an idea that was always right finally reaches enough people who can use it. She kept her notebooks. She walked the ridge every morning before anything else, in every weather, because the ridge was the thing she'd committed to and everything else was downstream of it. The native grass in the original lower section was in its 3rd year now and was behaving the way Fenwick's models predicted mature restoration would behave, self-sustaining in a way that the first 2 years had not been, holding its gains through the dry spells, recovering faster from disturbance, beginning to provide the kind of erosion resistance and water retention that changed how the whole watershed functioned. Margaret was 5 years old. She had ceased to tolerate Pruitt's granddaughter, who was now 10 and persistent, and had progressed to something that could charitably be described as acknowledgement. The girl came up with her grandfather on Saturdays and wrote things in a notebook she'd bought herself, and sometimes she asked questions that Lydia answered carefully and completely, the way Walt had answered her questions when she was young and didn't know yet that she was learning something. One Saturday in October, almost exactly 3 years since she'd driven that rusted trailer up Route 9C with 18 sick goats and $847 in a checking account and a folder of papers that made her hands shake, the girl asked her a question that stopped her mid-sentence. They were standing at the edge of the upper section, which had been recovering now for over 2 years since the fire, and had progressed from black ash to thin scrub to something that was beginning, in places, to look like what Walt's journal said it had looked like 70 years ago. "How did you know it would work?" the girl said. Lydia looked at the ridge. It was the question people had been asking her for 3 years in various forms, at conferences and interviews from other ranchers who stood in their own damaged land and needed to know before they could commit. They all wanted the answer to be something they could take home and use, a method, a data point, a scientific principle they could hold on to when their own doubts started pulling at them. She thought about the honest answer, not the useful answer, the honest one. "I didn't," she said. "Not for certain." The girl looked at her. "Then how did you start?" Lydia thought about that, about a livestock auction and 18 sick goats and a room full of men who laughed, about a man who crouched at a dry creek bed and let dirt fall through his fingers and said, "This mountain remembers things," about herself standing in the yard on the first night, watching those animals spill out of the trailer into the evening light and thinking that she had no idea if any of this was going to work and that she was going to do it anyway. "My grandfather believed something that he couldn't prove yet," she said, "and I believed him." She paused. "That's not nothing. That's actually most of it." The girl was quiet for a moment, looking at the ridge with the kind of focused, unperformed attention that most adults have to work to maintain, and some children still do naturally. Then she opened her notebook and wrote something down. Lydia didn't ask what. Some things you write down because you need to keep them, and the keeping is between you and the page. She knew that better than most. She looked out at the ridge one more time, at the 3rd-year native grass in the lower section and the 2nd-year recovery in the post-fire zone, and the upper sections that were slow but moving, always moving, doing what the land does when you give it what it needs and then get out of its way. At the fence panels and the water lines and the barn that still listed east and probably always would. At the morning light coming across the hill country in the long, flat way of October, when the sun is low enough to illuminate rather than bleach, and everything on the slope cast a shadow that showed you exactly what was there. It wasn't finished. It was never going to be finished, not in the way finished usually means. But it was real, and it was working, and it was going to keep working because the soil held what it had been given, and the land had a memory that went deeper than anything that had been done to it, and sometimes that was enough. Most of the time, that was enough. She put her notebook in her jacket pocket and went back to work.